Hi, everyone. My name is Ruben Adery. I'm a dialect coach here in Los Angeles, California, and I help language learners, teachers, and performers develop natural sounding pronunciation in 5 different languages in order to build confidence and really create a nice first impression. Because I think accents are fascinating. Foreign or native, they give us a spoken identity, a persona really, in any given language that tends to give off an impression. Last year, I actually opened my talk using a foreign accent, actually 2 foreign accents, and for the first minute or so, I convinced a few people that I was from Argentina, and many others, in fact, that I was from Israel. And while it's super fun and a useful skill to have when it comes to acquiring a foreign pronunciation, what's more interesting is how accents can be broken down into individual sounds, into stressed or unstressed syllables, linking patterns, even pitch movement or fixed tonal patterns. Today, I want to share a few techniques with you that not only enhance your own understanding of American English pronunciation, but also help you detect unique characteristics of various foreign accents in English. This will give you a little insight into the phonology of those languages if you're trying to pad your stats. It might also help speakers bridge the gap between language groups that may have trouble understanding one another. Although non-native speakers most often tell me that they understand non-natives way better than they understand native speakers, but we'll have some fun with sounds for the next 30 minutes or so. Many of the techniques that I use to sound like a native in a different language, I learned from foreign accents in English. I just did the backwards math, They make a slight mistake or something just stands out, and I just assume that it's tied to their native language. I did this, and I still do this with students, with friends, family, really anyone whose accent I can access very often. And more importantly, I've been able to organize these sounds or the accents and understand them a little bit more clearly over the last few years. So I'm going to present a few useful observations that not only will help your accent in a foreign language, or maybe even English, but also to recognize the nuances in pronunciation and just understand why certain sounds change from one language to the other. To tie it all together and to keep it simple for today, because I could talk about this for hours, we're going to center around one specific letter, the letter T, and show you how you can detect features of a foreign accent just by listening to their pronunciation of the letter T in all of its environments. Because it does have many environments. And that's why we have to define a few terms before we continue. Make it a little nerdy here, but that's what the Polyglot gathering is all about. One really big challenge when it comes to speaking a foreign language is understanding the difference between what's called prescriptive and descriptive pronunciation or grammar, where prescriptive refers to how you're supposed to say something according to the rules, what's prescribed, basically, right? And it's usually how people speak when they isolate individual words. Descriptive pronunciation, on the other hand, represents the way that we speak the language day to day, kind of pushing words together and modifying the rules, often going against what you might think based on the spelling. Especially in American English, which is a language with really particular spelling patterns, meaning not all the letters are produced one-to-one consistently in the same way. It will very much depend on its environment. And these different environments will create what we call allophones, which is just a fancy term for variations of sounds produced by one single letter. So one letter, many sounds. One thing that you can do to enhance your accent in English, or any language really, is to identify the most prominent allophones or letters, allophones of letters that you're starting to get familiar with, maybe solidifying certain things. For example, you may already know that a word that begins with an R in Spanish or in Italian will get trilled, r. So you might say rojo or Roma. But the same exact R, just one R between vowel sounds, is flipped or just a tap, like in the word pero or loro. So these allophonic variations, that's a nice term, are not always widely shared or even known at all when it comes to language instruction. Plus, pronunciation isn't always the priority, right, in every language program, leaving many to treat those foreign letters just like they would the same or the most similar letter or sound in their native language. So then the problem to deal with when it comes to mastering an accent isn't just learning to produce seemingly impossible new sounds. Secretly, it's knowing that the sounds that we've just accepted as the same are actually noticeably and tangibly different. We see a T in a foreign language and we just assume that it's a T, right? It is, after all, the same T. We use our T because it's the closest that we got. But what if we could pinpoint exactly what the allophones of T were? All 7 of them. And what if we understood which environments they found themselves? We're not only going to do that, but I'll also share with you a few short videos and video clips highlighting foreign accented pronunciations of T in many of these different environments. Ready? So again, we're really referring to the descriptive pronunciation of American English. In a lot of cases, North American English includes Canada and the United States. There are 7 different categories that we'll run through, but technically not all of them are true allophones, I'll be honest. For example, you'll see how the absence of sound can be more natural and colloquial than clearly pronouncing or releasing the T sound. So these environments all have to do with word position. This is important for the allophones identification. So as we go through them together, what you're looking for are T sounds at the beginning of a word or an important syllable, T sounds at the end of a word or a syllable, between vowels, between consonant sounds, after a particular consonant. I mean, it sometimes gets that specific. But again, these are consistent patterns, and they don't always match up with other foreign phonological systems. English is also unique in that it's considered what's called a stress-timed language, which means that the stressed syllable gets a little bit more love, a little bit more volume, sometimes pitch change, and the other unstressed syllables, not so much. But they do change in predictable ways. The first T sound that we'll remind you about is what I call the tennis T. Tennis T. Can you hear that? This is an aspirated initial T sound that often comes out like kind of like a T and an S pushed together. T, T. Depending on the speaker, of course. Some people have more breathy T's than others. But think of the words to, take, ten, t. We also use this T when we initiate the stressed syllable. So you might have words like between or until, where they're in the middle of the word and we're still doing this tennis T. Again, this is produced with the tip of your tongue, the very, very tip of your tongue behind your teeth, which are usually closed, by the way. And that extra puff of air makes a difference. T. To compare, we're going to listen to the beautiful Colombian accent of Sofia Vergara as she says the word 2 and 22. Let's listen to hear how she pronounces it.
And we each had like 2 bowls of pasta a day. It was like 22 bowls of pasta each.
One more time.
And we each had like 2 bowls of pasta a day. It was like 22 bowls of pasta each.
All right, so 22 bowls of pasta. You can hear, of course, something slightly different here. Here she's using an unaspirated T, right? She speaks Spanish natively, that makes sense. But in fact, even sounds like it's interdental, like her tongue is between her teeth. And you do that just by sliding your tongue forward, literally, and actually making contact with the blade of your tongue, which is just past the tongue tip. And what it does, it seals off all the air, and it kind of makes this muted D sound. 22 bowls of pasta, 22. So this slight variation, of course, is noticeable. Alternatively, speakers of a language like Brazilian Portuguese will do something quite different. Listen here to Anderson Silva as he says that he's too old for fight. I mean, he's too old to fight.
I know I'm too old for fight. I know I'm too old for fight. I know.
All right, so if you hear that closely, he's too old for fight. Of course, this is something that not only beginners struggle with from Portuguese to English. You do see it most often in earlier stages, to be fair. It's also surprising since in Portuguese, you do have a tu sound, like we heard from Sofia Vergara, tu. There are words in Portuguese that have tu. Tudo, tupi, the indigenous language, or even YouTube, the word for YouTube. So a bit strange that they say chu a lot of the times, but I suspect this may come from British pronunciations of words like tube or tutor, tu, where it has that kind of like CH flavor to it, chew it. But surely a marker of a Brazilian accent. It's an easy way to tell if someone's from Brazil. Chu old, chu go. You'll also see in Brazilian accents other what I put in here, epenthesis or added syllables. So this chu ch sound you might hear at the end of words too. Words like street instead of street, or the number 8 they might pronounce with the letter H. 6, 7, 8. So this ch sound is actually kind of consistent, and it happens in different T environments. Same thing in different places. The next T sound is the little t, also known as the subtle t, or actually in linguistics as a flap or a tap t. So we see this most often between vowel sounds. So like in the words bottom, or city, even between words which sometimes messes with people's heads. Here you have at here, as we pronounce that in North American English, at a, one at a time, for example, at a time. Even water. This even includes T's that come after sounds, like party, 40, or words that have T plus a vocalic L, like in bottle or little, of course. And this is important. This is the main difference, I suppose, between North American English, or an Australian English too, because they do that, and British English, which is most often, aspirated tennis T. Most foreigners will pronounce this T like the Latin T that we heard from Sofia Vergara, but have a listen to the French accent of the economist and author Thomas Piketty, as he says the words prosperity and inequality.
The idea that you get prosperity out of inequality just didn't work out. The idea that you get prosperity out of inequality just didn't work out.
All right, so prosperity inequality. You hear these again, kind of tennis T's here, and aspirated T, which first tells me that French has that to begin with. We didn't hear that from other accents. And among other things, it stands out as pretty French. And you even get extra bursts of T in the words didn't and out. Let's listen again.
The idea that you get prosperity out of inequality just didn't work out.
Yeah, work out. Little bursts of air here in T sounds, but this is just, again, prescriptive pronunciations, overly pronouncing them. They're not wrong pronunciations. We're not talking about that, but the colloquial nature wouldn't match this with North American English. You'll hear a similar pronunciation of the T sound in this next clip of Gal Gadot's Israeli accent, as she talks about her musical influences and the decades. She mentions the 80s and the 90s. Listen to this.
I loved Madonna, 80s and 90s. I loved Madonna, 80s and 90s.
All right, so 80s and 90s, 80s and 90s. It's a little bit less aspirated than the French T here, but these, these two words are a little harder to identify as little T's, since the word 80s has two silent letters. I mean, this is a weird thing to think of. Look at the word 80s. We have a silent GH, and 90s isn't even between vowel sounds. It's actually this N plus T, but for some reason it still does the little T thing. Why English voices a T sound, making it sound like a D, it makes sense, but sometimes it's hard to spot. Say it again.
I loved Madonna, 80s and 90s.
80s and 90s. Little T sounds here to make a difference. We would just say 80s, and 90s. 80s and 90s. The third allophone of T we're moving here, and a big one. It's a big one here. We're talking about probably the most mispronounced when trying to master an American English accent, at least. I call it the sweet T. Sweet T. And it involves muting or stopping the T pronunciation without releasing the t. So we don't want to hear that extra burst of air. Sweet T, sweet. This happens when the T is at the end of a word or at the end of a syllable, which usually means that it's a T right before a consonant sound. So in the phrase here, don't get caught, as opposed to don't get caught. Don't get caught. It even happens in between words, like we saw with the little T, and it's a crucial sound to avoid unnecessary over pronunciations. So we'll say at night, as opposed to at night. I have quite a few examples of the sweet T to show you, so let's listen to some Singlish and Singaporean English and get to know a little bit more about how they speak in Singapore. So we'll hear the speaker in this clip say a bit of disbelief or shock, something that's not good. That's the line, and we'll hear how this pronunciation comes out.
It's a bit of disbelief or shock, usually at something that's not good.
More time.
It's a bit of disbelief or shock, usually at something that's not good.
All right, so with this accent, I'm hearing an extra sweet T, meaning that this accent really stops the voice early on using a glottal stop, and this even seems to carry over into words that don't just have P's, but don't just have T's, but also P, K, and D sounds. So listen as she says, not good, instead of not good, which you might hear differences in American English, at least, between a T and a D. She says,
it's a bit of disbelief or shock, usually at something that's not good.
Not good. And the shock, also the shock, where we don't hear that K sound. It's a bit of a shock. And you hear that kind of cut off. Again, that's just a slight difference between these language groups. It's impossible really to think of this specific sound as sweet T without highlighting the Italian accent. In this next short clip, you'll see the speakers say, I don't know why, but, at the end of this clip. It's very short, but listen to the pronunciation of the word but, as he says this now.
Yes, I think the same. I don't know why, but yes, I think the same. I don't know why, but
I think the same. I don't know why, but of course, with some minimal searching, you can learn that the Italian doesn't produce words that have a T at the end natively, and so you not only hear this aspirated T at the end, but you also hear this extra vowel sound. This is actually a phenomenon that we call paragogy, which is a fancy, again, nerdy term, paragogy, which is a type of epenthesis, which is just adding an extra sound to a word. In this case, we're adding it to the end of a word. But, Italian accent, and you'll hear this in a lot of different accents. In fact, a really similar thing happens in Japanese. Let's listen to one more time to the Italian speaker.
yes, I think the same. I don't know why, but
and listen again to compare that to this Japanese accent. Here he's going to say the phrase, it becomes is what we're listening for.
If you pronounce this like me, it becomes a totally different word that means rain.
Did you hear that? It becomes.
If you pronounce this like me, it becomes a totally different word that means rain.
It becomes. So in this case, the speaker is voicing the T. It turns into a little t. And of course, this is a small change, but epenthesis, in this case, in a phrase like it becomes, it can be confusing for a listener, since in English, an extra could be a whole different word completely. It might throw off the flow a little bit. It becomes is actually adding two additional phonemes that the listener is not expecting to hear, again, in North American English. It becomes. Now we're adding a tap T, it, and an extra vowel in between the consonants. It becomes. Epenthesis. And so we'll hear that one more time. And even in this last rep, listen for the pronunciation in the phrase different word. Hear this extra T sound as well.
If you pronounce this like me, it becomes a totally different word that means rain.
It becomes and different word. Really nice. There are some accents from India, for example, that do something really unique with the T. They actually use a retroflex T when they curl their tongue back, and you make a slight tap with the underside of your tongue, which also mutes the sound a little bit. So listen to the final sounds of the phrase, don't try it.
Don't try it. Don't try it.
All right, so this is a pretty clear difference in the T pronunciation, a very light sound, and we do that from curling the tongue back and pulling it forward as we're going into the next sound. Here we hear that, but it's not using the front part of the tip of our tongue. You can hear that light tap at the end for sure. One more time.
Don't try it. Don't try it.
Yeah, you hear that light tap at the end. Same exact placement, in fact, just using a different part of the tongue. You just flip your tongue over, all of a sudden it changes. Going back to Brazil for a minute, I try to include many languages from all over the world, but I do mainly work with Latin languages on top of English and Hebrew, and so I have a little bit more to say about these. But so we're on the beach in Brazil here, and listening to this woman say the phrase, not true, you'll hear a little extra sound in that link between the two words. Have a listen.
People outside of Brazil think we are so carefree, and this is not true.
Again.
People outside of Brazil think we are so carefree, and this is not true.
So not true. Yeah, we have an extra T release in this one. Of course, where a native speaker might mute that T, not true. We have an extra, an extra sound here. Not true. the T should be linked to this T linked to the next T should combine, and we don't have to pronounce those twice. But we want to make sure that as we're learning the language, we can mute those T's, but again, to avoid any unnecessary sounds. One more time.
People outside of Brazil think we are so carefree, and this is not true.
Not true. Finally, to illustrate the really common mispronunciation, it's the Israeli accent again, with a sweet T right before a W sound. Listen to Gal Gadot. I know I may be a little obsessed, but listen to her say the phrase "right when," and listen for that T pronunciation.
And right when I finished that one, and right when I finished that one.
All right, so here we have, this right when, which she does come back at the end and say right when, and she does say the phrase that one. So the same links are there, T to a W, right when and that one should both be pronounced the same at least. So here she does it. She gets 1 out of 2, but of course, to me, Gal Gadot can do no wrong. So listen again just for your listening practice.
And right when I finished that one.
Again, really, really slight, but it's there. We keep moving. The last 4 here, we have the protected T, which is an allophone of T that many of you will find very similar to the T in your native language. It's an unaspirated T, mostly because it's combined with another consonant right before it. See the examples here. Even in the word protected, protected, instead of this tennis T, for example, which takes away some of that air. So words like stop or after, they don't sound like the tennis T, stop or after. There are no special clips of this, specifically this sound, because most of the T's that you've seen already have been protected T's, these unaspirated T's. So we'll keep going. The next one is my favorite, actually, because it's so unique. Also completely optional. It's the Toronto T. Looking at the second T in the word in the city name, Toronto, you can say Toronto or you can say Toronto, but you may find that dropping that T creates a little bit more fluidity. It happens almost exclusively after the sound N. So N plus T plus another vowel sound is most famously applied to words like 20 or plenty, internet or internet, wanted, Santa. A lot of cities in California, Santa. Since N and T happen to be in the same place in your mouth, it's not a huge surprise that these sounds kind of blend, but it does sound more fluid in North American English to say 20. We even see this applied between 2 words, for example. Can't imagine becomes I can imagine, can imagine. Or, don't ask would become don't ask. The T just melts right in. After the Toronto T, we'll find the Manhattan T. You're seeing a little connection here. Manhattan T is another T allophone that doesn't come naturally to most non-native speakers. It involves a sweet T stop sound and it finishes with a glottalized n. So you're kind of stopping the word and then continuing with your throat. It's surprisingly found in many, many words across the English language, especially in British English, most often with a vowel T, vowel N, like a eaten or cotton. And you also see NT, vowel N, so words like mountain or sentence. It's fine to say mountain and sentence, of course. They're fine and clear, but to come off a little bit more prescriptively in North America is kind of how it sounds. Listen to the word Latin here, used with a Ukrainian accent. Here again, we're hearing the unaspirated T instead of the glottalized T.
The only reason I came to Latin America.
It's quick. Latin, instead of Latin. And of course, the glottalized T can be found all over the UK with a slightly more open mouth position. So instead of doing the n thing, they just keep their mouths open to say You'll hear this in a moment here. We lose that n sound. Listen to the speakers say the phrase bottle of water.
I need to go to the shop to buy a bottle of water. Now that is a very, very British sound right there.
A bottle of water. Bottle of water. Very British indeed. Very nice. I love those ones. In fact, it's a great sounded practice to use different parts of your mouth and throat. The final allophone of T that we have is the complete absence of the pronunciation itself, as this is the silent T. We call this the Christmas T. Make sure to not pronounce the T at all in words like listen or castle. Even in words that, what I call T sandwiches, where they kind of find themselves between two consonant sounds. Facts, to me, sounds kind of like the fax machine. Fax machine. But again, you could argue the opposite. If you want to really pronounce that CTS cluster, you go ahead. But so there you have it. This is the 7 allophones of T. A few examples of how they can be modified around the English-speaking world. We have the tennis T, which is initial and aspirated. The little T, which is a voiced tap, like a D or an R in many languages. We have a sweet T, which is final and muted. A protected T, which is unaspirated and clustered with another consonant. A Toronto T, which is completely optional but often dropped. A Manhattan T, which involves the glottal stop in the N sound. And finally, the Christmas T, which is completely silent. So, and that's not every letter. I mean, it's not that every letter is going to have 6 or 7 allophones, so don't get discouraged. The letter T just happens to be a unique situation, and definitely one to call your attention to as you learn the different nuances in pronunciation. Most consonants will have maybe 2 or 3 variations max, and the slight variation may not even be noticeable. I hope that on top of being fun and entertaining, you take away, something valuable to your language acquisition. How detailed pronunciation can be in a foreign language, yes, but also how feasible it is to classify and maybe even pronounce some of these slight variations. Ideally, it will even help your communication with colleagues and friends around you. And furthermore, if mastering an accent is really your goal, I hope this encourages you to question the spelling in the relationships with spelling and sound. Slow down the pronunciations to see how individual sounds will change, and see what happens when you connect 2 or 3 words in one phrase, especially with fixed idioms or prepositional phrases, for example. If you're interested, I'm going to move a little quickly too, because I have a couple resources here to share with you. But if you're interested in some more audio and targeted listening resources, I would recommend Youglish, which, if you haven't heard, is a wonderful site that creates a playlist by native speakers of words that you search for in 14 different languages. It'll queue up the video a couple seconds before the word is about to be said. It's got subtitles so you can anticipate the pronunciation. And it's incredible. They have 14 languages, even sign languages on Youglish. And finally, the Speech Accent Archive, which is a complete audio kind of compilation of volunteer speakers reading the same paragraph in English. So you could go there looking for English accents of, Afrikaans or Gujarati speakers and get a sense of what people sound like from there. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share just a little bit about what I do with you. That's the T. Now I'll take your cues. Thank you guys so much. We have quite a few questions here, so we'll get into it. The first one asks, how useful would you say that theoretical knowledge of phonetics and phonology is when practicing an accent? It's a great question. I think that it will always help. They create the IPA for a reason. It's not always the most inviting system, because it is a new language. If you're learning a new alphabet like Japanese or Arabic, you already have to learn a new system, so it adds something on top of the mix before you get into the conversation. But that said, it's incredibly, incredibly useful to understand the phonology and the breakdown of the available sounds first. Whether you know the phonetics in the where to put the teeth, tongue, lips, and jaw is, I'd say, less of a priority initially, but I would highly encourage understanding these things, even if they're not perfect. Knowing that there's a difference between these 2 T's or 2 R sounds is kind of half the battle. And if someone catches you in a mispronunciation, or if you catch yourself, you can say, well, I knew that, I'm just working on it. But getting those things down is really, really important. And it just depends on how technical you're willing to get. Great question. What are the most interesting dialects people should know, and why? That's a huge open-ended question. And dialects of what? Of course, I think that the most interesting dialects are always the ones that few people know about. There's sounds that we haven't even thought to produce with our mouths. I like, languages that have clicks in them. That's not only African languages, but mostly so. I think, again, not sure which language you're referring to, but in general, you should learn and consider interesting the dialects that are really spoken by the fewest people, and find out what really variations they have in sound. Maybe it's surprising or interesting that they actually have a lot of similarities among different languages in the area. And languages like Basque or Finnish, or languages that have no kind of tie to the region, are also really, really interesting. How did they get there? Great question. All right. Going to the Q part. Why should one aspire to master an accent instead of just being happy with a good but not perfect pronunciation? This is a great question. This is the question, right? Why master your pronunciation? The question is, does a language have form? If you're learning grammar, why wouldn't you follow the form of the grammar? I know that they're different things, right? The physical features of phonology and phonetics versus just the knowledge of this word ends in an A. But if you're not understanding that the system pronounces that A differently than in your language, you got bad form, let's call it that. It's not that you're not going to be understood. You should absolutely speak how you feel comfortable. But just like any physical activity, exercising, lifting weights, playing tennis or golf, there's a really specific form that actually helps you do a lot better with less work. And so it might be because of the stresses of people always asking you where you're from, what your background, oh, I detect an accent, and then they come with this whole conversation that you can almost predict and expect each time. For some people, that's frustrating and it's annoying. So that's one reason to do it. Another reason is to connect more with people. A lot of talks I've been hearing during the gathering have to do with idiomatic usage and building bonds. And when someone starts speaking with your native accent and they're not from there, it's a connector. I mean, I'm telling you, from Argentinian backgrounds and Israeli, you guys saw maybe last year, people just start to say, like, how did you get that good at that language? But I didn't give them a whole essay or show all my grammar skills. I just created this impression that I did have those skills. And so it could really set the feeling, put you at ease for the rest of the conversation if you have that accent down. It's controversial, of course, but I would say that you do it for reasons of security and self-confidence. Any recommendations for accent reduction for those whose foreign accent got fossilized? Yeah, absolutely. For any of you who have fossilized accents, meaning that's how I speak, maybe we didn't learn the phonology early on. So the first thing to do is to go back and say, well, what are the sounds that are different from my language to this target language, native language to target language? Maybe you just never realized what that was. Most of the people that I work with are in this situation. They've spent 25, 30 plus years learning and studying a language, maybe less, but many so, and they don't even know what sounds to change. They have no clue how to change their accent. And so this is the question, right? How do you go about doing it? We learn the phonology of your language. That's important. What do you have to start with? What are you working with, right? Which sounds are different from your language natively into that target language? Second, after you identify them, you have to see if you can actively pronounce the two. Not lose your accent and reduce your accent, but pronounce both, right? You can say 22 or 22. You can do them both. It's an ability. Third is to be able to implement those into the conversation. Once you identify what they are and you can pronounce both of them, then you can start to say, maybe I can say 20 here. I feel comfortable with that word. I've said it enough, but by myself with the coach. I think it's sounding really, really natural. right? So there's a kind of a 3-step system. Identify the sounds from your language to the target language. Try to pronounce them both and hear the clear difference. And then, when you're comfortable, implement that into your conversations. Is it possible to detect an accent based on the intonation of words or phrases rather than the pronunciation of sounds? Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're coming from a language that has fixed tones or a different tonal structure, which is most languages. Most of the time, this is one of the aspects of an accent or pronunciation that is really blurry to get into, is intonation, or helping someone with their intonation, especially if they don't have like an ear for those sounds. But absolutely, there are things that I noticed. I'll give you an example. In Brazilian Portuguese speakers of English, they'll stress and therefore raise the intonation of a word that's kind of earlier in the sentence than you're supposed to. So instead of saying, "I've been here for 5 years," they might say, "I've been here for 5 years. I've been here for 5 years," like almost like kind of a question intonation, instead of just choosing the right word to say, "I've been here for 5 years." Just a small example, but there are plenty of tonal things, question asking, or just products of the language that maybe they think is accurate. Maybe they're borrowing tones from a different dialect of that language, but absolutely, there are the main 4 pieces of the pronunciation you'll notice are the sounds, the phonemes and units of sound. You'll see the rhythm, where they stress words or where they emphasize the syllables, the linking together, and then finally something we call prosody, which is this kind of intonation pattern. So all 4 of those things can absolutely affect the accent. What's the difference between little t and Manhattan t? The little t, little, as you can see my tongue here, little, is a tap. It's the same as an R in Spanish, in Russian, Arabic, in Dutch. If you do this tap sound in a word like bottom, there's that tap or that flap t. Call it a little t because in the word little, we pronounce it that way, little. In the word Manhattan, we don't say Manhattan, Hatton. At least most people don't. Hatton would be a little t for a Manhattan t. Manhattan, and there's no movement here. It's all happening in the throat. Manhattan, little. Slight difference. Why don't you use IPA? Wouldn't it make everything easier? Of course it would. Yeah, and at the Polyglot gathering, I suppose the IPA is the place the place to use it, right? But I suppose that not everybody knows the IPA. First of all, there are also symbols and weird variations of letters, vocalic letters and dots and lines that aren't accessible for everybody. It's a big problem also is to find one phonetic system. Even though there's an international phonetic alphabet, they don't carry across every language. So it's important to know those differences. And if you don't know the symbols, we're going to have to describe it to you anyway. So my approach to this is trying to use examples from the language. When I'm working one-on-one or with a small group, I'll also use examples from your native language, which is really important to make that connection. If you have this sound in your language, a tap T or a sweet T, then we want to use that, and we would then use your own language as an example. I also would spell things with your native alphabet. I've learned Korean and Japanese writing systems just to be able to spell English words phonetically for Korean and Japanese students. So it's mostly about connecting to the person and not just having one system that fits all, because it doesn't always. Time for a couple more. How do we master an accent on our own? I kind of talked about that before with this 3-step process. If you're trying to do this, identify the sounds that are different from your native language to a target language. Really be able to try to pronounce those 2 one after the other, and then and implement that. Really understand that. Get feedback. That's probably the one thing that people don't realize is the most important. You need to know the sounds. You need to know what you need to work on and what's missing from your pronunciation. Find some, this is what I'll add from the previous question. Find someone or a group of someones that can give you consistent feedback on your pronunciation, good and bad. Understand that it's all constructive. We're all trying to work towards the same goal. Most people who I help and critique and bring things to their attention, they're just like, finally, somebody who's telling the truth, you know, being honest and telling you like it is. So get people like that who can tell you like it is. Time for one more. Which other allophones are as notable as the T? That's great. Probably the closest one is the letter D, in English at least, but you can tell how that might be the case. So when you have a D or a T pronunciation, you might even find that these sounds are sometimes likened, sometimes exactly the same. Consider the word leader, as in the unit of liquid measurement, liter, and somebody who leads, a leader. So already you're seeing a D pronunciation instead of a T, and that's going to happen a lot. D at the beginning of a word sounds like a D, kind of a percussive sound. D between vowels sounds a little bit exactly like a little T. D at the end of a word, quite different. So there's quite a few allophones of D as well. But T and D are really the weirdest ones in American English, at least. It's a great question, and thank you guys. I think we have to wrap it up, but thank you so much for your attention and really interesting questions. If you'd like to learn more about me and what I do, you can visit my website, which is in the program, or search for linguistics with an X, linguistics, and social media. Can't wait to see you all at the next event. Enjoy the rest of the gathering. Bye-bye.